We have a delegation. We have a delegation before we start that wanted to address you. A brief presentation by the committee, People Loving Undeserving Transitory Objects, or Pluto. And as a signatory, I'm going to stand behind them.
Good morning. So we have here a petition that many of you may have signed. And this petition, we have over 100 signatures, including Mrs. Bailey, Pastor Bradley, Dr. Schultz, Dr. Beakey, Mr. Pittman, and many of you students. And so this petition, we will read this petition to you.
The petition reads, "We, the undersigned, do hold to the traditional belief that Pluto, the celestial body formerly titled a planet, was unjustly removed of that title and is deserving of second consideration as such. Insofar as we have signatures below, we do insist that Pluto be reinstated as a planet." And so, Dr. Faulkner, on behalf of this committee, and due to the marvelous chemical, physical, and emotional properties of your topics presented unto us, we hereby, in return, present unto you this petition, to which extent you may do with as you wish, for good or evil.
Well, thank you.
No problem.
That's part of the petition, too.
Oh wait, no, that's the petition over
right.
the bottom one.
I've never been served with a petition before, but I appreciate that. I thank you for that. We will take it under advisement, and we'll pretend this is a democracy, but keep one thing in mind. It isn't.
Just be glad it wasn't a subpoena, okay? And now a petition from the Flat Earth Society. No, I'm just... All right. With that, will you please give a very warm welcome to our speaker who has a good sense of humor, Dr. Danny Faulkner.
Klaatu Barada Nikto. What did you expect? May the force be with you? Nanu Nanu? Certainly you didn't expect live long and prosper, did you? Well, clearly, aliens, UFOs, spaceships, all those kind of things are very popular in our culture, if not in science fiction, in many, many other ways. I want to address that today. And so they're very popular sorts of things, as I said. Before I proceed, though, I want to show you a cartoon of Garfield that recently appeared in the newspapers. He's out at the fence where his girlfriend Arlene is there, and he says, "Where have you been? I was worried about you." To which Garfield says, "I was abducted by aliens." And she says, "Really?" with the big eyes. And she says, "Now I'm worried about you." All right? And I worry about people who've claimed all sorts of abductions and weird things. I'm not going to talk about abductions today, but I will talk about the UFO phenomenon. And I think it's very important that we discuss these things from a biblical basis. That's what this worldview is all about. We should ground everything in Scripture. So today I will be sharing with you that chapter in the Bible about UFOs and aliens. You've read that, haven't you? You haven't? Well, that's a relief, because there isn't one, okay? So what do you do? What do you do when there's, some things are really directly addressed in Scripture, but what do you do when a question really isn't directly done in Scripture? There are a lot of examples, like, for instance, last November, I had to ask myself how I ought to vote in this election. That was a tough question. Well, what you do, I think most of you know the answer to this, is you study the Bible, hopefully before you get to this question that you have before you, and you derive some principles about how we ought to live our lives, how God deals with us, what God expects of us, and you can take those principles and apply them to that. And I think we can do the same thing with the questions of UFOs and ETs. Now, what I want to do here is I want to show you a series of videos from various television shows and movies that featured aliens. And I want you to see how many of those you recognize. Did anyone recognize all of them? Oh, quite a few hands. Very good. Congratulations, you are sci-fi nerds. And I would be disappointed in a group this size if we didn't have at least a few of you. Some have to go way back. Some of those things are back before even I was born. Yeah, they had film back then, believe it or not. That actually did exist. Before we get started, let's try to define some terms. I think it's very important because I'm concerned that people many times use terms and they either don't understand what they're saying, they're misusing the term one way or the other, whether it's out of ignorance or out of intention, I'm not sure. One of them is the term ET, and that's short, and this is a technical term, by the way. It's short for extraterrestrial, extra meaning outside of, terrestrial meaning outside of the Earth, so it's from someplace else. Those would be space aliens or LGM. And what does LGM stand for? Little green men, yes. Okay, that's not a technical term, but it's a commonly used one. The next term I want to define for you is not a technical term, flying saucer. Presumably a flying saucer is a spaceship flown by little green men. All right, again, not a precise term like some of these others. This next term is a very technical term, UFO, and it stands for unidentified flying object. How many of you have seen a UFO? Raise your hands. Not very many hands go up. Okay, let's go through this again. UFO means unidentified flying object. So if you see something in the sky, maybe moving, so it appears to fly, and you think it's something because you can see it, and you don't know what it is, you haven't identified it, then you have seen a UFO. How many of you have seen a UFO? A lot more hands go up. You know what? If your hand is not up, then either you haven't been paying attention at all, and particularly you haven't been paying attention here to understand the terms. All of us have seen UFOs. I have seen UFOs. All right? However, I've never walked away from a UFO. And it doesn't mean I ran away either. What it means is I've always converted it into an IFO. That's a technical term, less known than the others. And that means identified flying object. So once you identify what it is, then you know it's no longer a UFO, it is now an IFO. A lot of people go out, they see something in the sky, they don't know what it is. Oh, it's a UFO, they think that means flying saucer. It's a flying saucer, they're done. But the moment you identify it as a, misidentify it, I think, but you think you've identified it as a flying saucer, is it a UFO anymore? No, you've identified it. Okay? You've identified it as a flying saucer. So a flying saucer cannot be a UFO. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Because a UFO means it's unidentified. Well, I want to make two notes here. First of all, a UFO and a flying saucer are not the same thing. You like that picture of that flying saucer? That's obviously not piloted by an LGM. That's a little kid, all right, I think. But anyway, a UFO and a flying saucer is not the same thing. And I hear people all the time use them interchangeably. For years, people would ask me a question after, say a presentation I gave or after a planetarium show I gave, and they'd say, what about UFOs? And I heard, what about unidentified flying objects? And I would start talking about that. And it was about 2 years ago, I finally realized when they asked me that question, they weren't asking me, what about UFOs? They were asking me, what about flying saucers? That's what they meant, but they didn't say that. Now, there's a radio show that's on the radio a lot at night. I won't tell you the name of the show, but it is heard from coast to coast. And oftentimes, if you listen to this show, the callers or the host or one of his guests will use the term UFO when very clearly what they mean are flying saucers. And I think the reason why they do that is because if you say flying saucer, people are going to think you're wacky. But if you say UFO, it sounds very technical and very scientific. So they say these UFOs are flying around and the aliens flying and all this kind of stuff. Well, no, if you think it really is a flying saucer, then it cannot be a UFO. And the primary goal of any UFO, when you see it, is to try to turn it into an IFO. And I'm batting 1,000. I've been able to convert mine every time. Well, how did this fascination with flying saucers get started? You know, people have always seen things in the sky that they could not understand. It goes back to ancient times, in the Middle Ages, the fairly recent times. But this whole fascination, interpreting in terms of UFO, this unknown phenomenon, really can be dated back to an event in the summer of 1947. No, not that event, a different event. All right? And it involves a man named Kenneth Arnold. And he was a businessman, lived in Washington State. And for part of his business, he would fly a light plane that he had. I don't know if it was his business owner or he owned it, but he used it to travel on some of his little business trips that he had. And he had a pilot's license, pretty technologically savvy guy. He took off from, I think, the Seattle-Tacoma airport. He was flying over to, I think it was Yakima he was going to. And as he flew past Mount Rainier, he reportedly saw 9 shiny objects flying along through the sky. And he was pretty interested in these things. They didn't look like any aircraft he had seen, but, you know, he was a pretty technologically savvy man. He knew, well, what he did is he estimated their speed. And what he did is he noticed how fast they seemed to be moving like this in his line of sight. And he estimated their distance to be many miles away. And so from the distance he thought that they were away, he could then figure out how fast they were moving. And he thought these things initially were moving close to twice the speed of sound. Now, by the way, if these things would have been right inside the cabin with him or right outside the cockpit, you know, beyond the windshield, he would have they would have been moving pretty slowly, actually. But he thought they were miles away. Now, at this point, nobody had broken the sound barrier yet. That was going to happen a few months later with Chuck Yeager. But being a pilot, he knew about these things. He knew it was only a matter of time that we would see such things. And he thought at the time what he was seeing was a squadron of super secret Army Air Corps planes that were flying in tight formation. They were experimentally thought, and they were actually flying faster than the speed of sound. Of course, the military denied that was the case. And in some people's estimation, when the government official denies something, it means it's true, right? That's the perverse logic that people have going on here. Well, he landed his plane an hour or so later, and he asked to speak to the head of this particular airport, and he debriefed. He told him what he saw, and word got around, so other people in the airport came by, and he told the story again and again and again. A reporter came by, and he told the story again. More reporters came by. So over several days, he gave the story once, again, and again, and again. Now, notice he described these as 9 shiny objects. They were flying objects, flying objects, and he described their motion like saucers skipping on water. And what he meant by this, if you take a round, flat object, like a saucer, you could do this, and you throw it with spin, when it hits the water, it kind of skips and it hovers, right? You know what I'm talking about? Kind of a cool motion, isn't it? I would suggest you don't use your mother's saucers, though. You use flat stones. It's a lot safer, okay? Your mother's not going to kill you if you do that, usually. All right, so he described their motion as like saucers skipping on water. Did he use the term flying and saucer, those two words together? No, he didn't. It was 2 days later in the Chicago Sun newspaper that those two words were conjoined for the first time, and the term flying saucer was born. And that summer, the term flying saucer was used a lot, and the word flying disc was used a lot, but that term flying disc kind of fell off the radar screen pretty quickly. And hundreds of reports quickly followed. They were all over the place. Hundreds there in the Northwest, across the United States, and eventually around the world. It's quite a rash that summer. And in fact, there was another thing that happened about the same time. A place you've probably never heard of, a little town called Roswell in eastern New Mexico. Yeah, I didn't think you heard of the place. These two ranchers were out on the range, and they sometime in the middle of June, and they ran across some debris lying on the desert floor. It was some wood and paper, plastic and wire, and they thought, what in the world is this? They had no idea. Looked it over, thought it was strange out in the middle of nowhere, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. And about a week later, they get back into town. They've been completely out of contact, and of course, the newspapers just lit on fire with the news of this flying saucers, or flying discs visible in Washington State. And they said, you know what? We think we saw the crash of one of those flying discs out on the desert floor. And so they reporters took the Air Force officials of a local base out there, and they quickly said, well, this is a crash of a weather balloon that we launched. Thank you, we'll just take all the pieces in. And the whole incident died that summer, right there. It was only until 30 years later that somebody resurrected what became to be known as the Roswell incident. It didn't really happen in 1947, it happened in 1978 when they resurrected the whole thing. There's a long story there. I'm not going to talk about that today, but I can give you a resource at the end where you can read more about it if you wish. By the way, in Roswell in 1947, there was a government cover-up. But it's not the cover-up you think it is. Okay, it's a different kind of cover-up. It has nothing to do with aliens and flying saucers and so forth. Why the sudden rash of UFO reports? As I said before, the things that people had seen things in the sky for a very long time, they didn't know what they were. And I would tell you perhaps there's the power of suggestion at play here. Now, back in the summer of 1975, there was one of the first big summer blockbuster movies that hit the screens, and this is before most of your time, but it had a guy that I think people tell me I look a lot like, Richard Dreyfuss. Anybody know what movie that was in 1975? No, that was in 1977. Everyone forgets this one for some reason. Dun, 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 dun. Jaws. Remember have you seen the movie Jaws, anybody? I've never seen it, by the way. But anyway, it just scared people witless that summer. It was amazing. People won't go back again and again. They were terrified by what they saw in this movie. And there were just thousands, maybe millions of shark reports that summer. I understand some beach communities saw a downturn in their attendance that summer. I guess the people thought they were relatively more safe going to the mountains instead of going to the beach. Now, I say relatively because I was between my junior and senior year at Bob Jones in Greenville, and I was spending a summer in town that year, and there was the Reedy River that flows through Greenville. Anybody been in the Reedy River in Greenville? I've waded it many times. It's about that deep. And there's a big waterfall that's down part of the way to get you down, before you get downtown with it, going upstream. And there were shark sightings in the Reedy River. There were great white sharks in the Reedy River, this deep, all right? Even better than that, up in the mountains, there's a Paris Mountain State Park, and I think also up in the Blue Ridge, there are these dams there that impound water. Some of it's used for the water system, and there were reports of sharks in there. All over the country, people were seeing sharks in creeks, the most unlikely places. What were they seeing? I guess, catfish, boots, tires, I don't know, all things they normally see, and they just misinterpreted because of these things. I believe also there's this belief in what do we call the plurality of worlds. What do I mean by that? Well, the plurality of worlds means that there are other worlds, other planets like us out there, like the Earth, with beings like us on them. And this is a fairly modern idea. You see, throughout most of history, everybody thought that the geocentric model, they thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. If that's the case, can there be a plural world then? No, the universe can only have at most one center, right? And if we're there, nobody else can be there. And so really it was inconceivable that you could have other worlds out there. The first person we know of that talked about this is a guy named Giordano Bruno, around 1599 or 1600, actually thought about these ideas. And as soon as people within a few decades after that began to believe the heliocentric theory, they began to think, well, wait a minute, there are other planets orbiting around the sun like the Earth, like Mars and Venus and so forth. Maybe they're populated. People thought maybe the moon had beings living on it. And soon they realized that the sun was a star. The reason why the stars at night appear so faint is they're so far away. So if the sun has planets orbiting around, maybe these other stars have planets, and some of those would have Earth-like planets and beings on those as well. I think it's a very modern idea, like the last 20 years. No, it goes back 300 years. So by the time you get to the 18th century, people are talking about it. Our second to President John Adams, as a young man in the 1750s, wrote in his diary one day some thoughts about the plurality of worlds. And by the time you get in the early 19th century, you have people talking about it a lot. And this is the world that Joseph Smith was born into. If you've studied Mormon theology and cosmology much, you will understand that plurality of worlds is very important. Did you know that Elohim, according to Joseph Smith and Mormon theology, was born a man on a planet called Kolob, or near a star called Kolob? It's kind of fuzzy. And he was then exalted and became a god over this planet. And so there are many other inhabited worlds in Mormon theology. Where did he get that idea? Well, that was a prevalent thinking that there were other plurality of worlds. And also this whole incident in 1947 was just 1 decade before Sputnik. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite launched by the Soviet Union in 1957. Again, Kenneth Arnold was a pretty savvy man. He knew that space travel was about to happen. A lot of people knew that because like 3 or 4 years before, the Germans had launched the first ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket. They launched it from the coast of France. It went across the English Channel. It actually went up into subspace. It entered into space briefly before it came back down, and hopefully for them, blowing up a block of London when it smashed into the ground and detonated its explosives. It was the first man-made object to actually venture into space. At the conclusion of the Second World War, both the U.S. and the Soviets were grabbing up all the German rocket scientists they could find. We got the lion's share. And also scooping up all the V-2 rockets they could find. And they took them back to their respective countries to develop this technology. With us, we sent them out to White Sands, New Mexico, and that became the nucleus of our rocket program, first for military and later on, a decade later, as it turns out, for space travel. Became the foundation of NASA eventually. Well, this people who knew this sort of stuff, they realized that it was only a matter of time before human beings would venture into space and begin exploring space. And they realized, well, if there are other civilizations on other worlds out there, if not in the solar system, other stars, then you would expect that some of those would be ahead of us. They would be technologically advanced beyond us. And so consequently, they may have already mastered space, and they could very well come to the Earth and visit us. So in the 1950s, there was a rash of sightings. There was also a rash of sci-fi movies about aliens coming here and so forth. So the conclusion I reach is that people now are interpreting things differently than they were before. We tend to interpret things in terms of what we know or what we think that we know. And so if you believe that sentient life like us is real common in the universe and technology is common in the universe, then it's quite natural then to think that perhaps, maybe, some of those aliens have already visited the Earth or will soon visit the Earth. Well, what are UFOs? I've been studying these for off and on for 4 decades or more. I go through little spasms. I'll go through reading a bunch and I'll lay off and come back and read some more. Most astronomers are interested in this sort of thing. So over the years I've developed opinions on this, and I've come to the conclusion that the vast majority of UFO sightings are misidentifications. What kind of things can you misidentify? Well, bright planets, for instance. Some people saw Jupiter outside, right, last night. It looks like incredibly bright, doesn't it? If you're driving along in your car, it's very easy to think that thing's moving. It moves with respect to the trees around you. It's easy to think it's actually moving, and people realize it's too bright to be a star. It doesn't look like an airplane. Maybe it's a flying saucer. Bright stars also do the same thing. Meteors, aurorae, comets, unusual cloud formations, will-o-wisp, satellites. I even saw an barium cloud released from a rocket. It was this big green glow in the sky. It was pretty cool looking. I wondered what it was. The next day in a newspaper, I read about it, what it was. They'd launched this thing off of Pensacola, and you could see it for hundreds of miles across the southeast. So many different things. People are not terribly familiar with the skies. They look up, they see something they've never noticed before, things that's unusual, and hence it must be a flying saucer. They're done. Some are out-and-out hoaxes. Back in the 1950s, people would take a hubcap and spin it and throw it in the sky and snap a photo of it. And if you don't know what a hubcap is, ask your parents, all right? And they also, there were other sorts of hoaxes. You all heard of crop circles? That was a rage like 40 years ago. People would wake up in the morning, this grain field nearby, there would be this swirling pattern. The grain's been flattened down, like barley or wheat or something knocked down. And the theory was, well, overnight a spacecraft hovered or landed at this spot, and soon it began appearing across the rest of England and then in Europe and around the world. This went on for years. Finally, and by the way, there were self-professed cereologists. Comes from the word cereal meaning grain. These are people who studied crop circles. And they would go in the lecture circuit, write their books, and then when one appeared, they would come out. They would make measurements of different, supposedly with some sort of radioactivity detector, and take photographs, and they would certify this is a legitimate crop circle. It cannot be man-made. It must have been made by some alien spacecraft last night. The fact that these things always occurred at intersections of roads near towns, never in the North 40, just kind of escaped these people. After a number of years of this, two men came forward in the UK. They called some reporters in, and they said, took them out to a grain field, and using some very sophisticated equipment, they produced a crop circle in a matter of minutes. What kind of sophisticated equipment did they have? They had a broad, flat board, a piece of wire, and a cap. And I think what they did is one guy stood in the middle or knelt in the middle with this wire attached, and the other guy just took the flat board attached to it like you would draw a circle with a compass and just flattened the grain down. That was it. They took their pictures, they hid the sophisticated equipment, called out one of these Syriologists, and he made his measurements and made his pronouncement. Yes, this is a legitimate thing, not man-made. It had to be made from an alien spacecraft. I once, with a friend of mine, we took has to do this in the winter. It's really got to be cold to do this. And we took some balsa wood and glued it together in a cross pattern. We put a bunch of birthday candles on it. And we took one of these really thin plastic bags that you get dry cleaning in. And we put this thing over this thing, taped it on the corners, and lit the matches. And it takes off like a hot air balloon. And you got this thing going up in the sky, and it's got this glow on it, and people see it and have no idea what it is. That's been done too. People have done all sorts of tricky things. There's some guys over in New Jersey a number of years ago who were sending flares up on a little balloon, and they ended up getting arrested for some charge they made up on these poor guys. So some are hoaxes. Now that leaves 1 or 2% that are unexplained. Does that mean then that they must be flying saucers? No, it just means we haven't figured out what they are yet. Just because I can't explain it doesn't mean it's not explainable in terms of some other phenomenon. So if you think I'm a skeptic on flying saucers, I am. I don't believe that we've had flying saucers visiting the Earth. I think, again, misidentification and hoaxes are playing a big role here. Well, in order to address this, let's ask a few questions. I got a couple of tough questions here. The first one's not too tough. Let's just assume for the minute that ETs exist. Okay, let's just assume for a minute that they've come here. All right, this is kind of in math and sometimes in logic, it's kind of the proof by contrapositive. You kind of assume what you're trying to show to be true and work your way backwards on it. Okay, if ETs exist, where would they come from? And I think the obvious answer is they come from other planets, either, if not in the solar system, in other stellar systems orbiting other stars. So, big question. Where did the life then on those other planets come from? Presumably they're not the only living creatures on the planets of origin. There are other creatures as well, just like we have many plants and animals on this particular planet. And there are really two possibilities. One possibility is evolution, which I defined for you twice now. I won't do it again. And the second one is the possibility of creation. Does that pretty well cover the possibilities? If life exists somewhere, either somebody made it or it just happened by itself. I think that's pretty clear, the options we have there. Let's consider the possibility of evolution first. Okay, hopefully nobody here is an evolutionist, but let's just suppose for the sake of argument that evolution does explain these creatures. All right, you will find that people who believe in the evolution of the ETs from other planets almost universally believe in evolution on the Earth. That is, they believe that life spontaneously arose on this planet. There was a day 4 billion years ago where there was no life on Earth, and then the next day there was. That's what they assume. And so if evolution is the naturalistic explanation for how life arose on this planet, big question arises, did life arise elsewhere? And again, there are two possibilities. One possibility is no. And that means then that life arose in only one place in the entire universe, and that is on the Earth. Now, think about that. By definition, that makes the Earth unique, doesn't it? And if the Earth is unique in this respect, then that makes it special. And if the Earth is somehow special, doesn't that drag you right back to a belief in creation? Think that through very carefully. I think you'll agree with me that if life is unique to the Earth, then the Earth is uniquely special, and that almost inevitably will take you right back to creation. So consequently, you will find, not all, but the vast majority of evolutionists believe that there's life elsewhere in the universe. because they can't stand the fact that we're so special we would have it here and nowhere else. So if life arose elsewhere in the universe, the belief then is that life likely arises wherever the conditions are right. What are those right conditions? Well, you've got to have the right temperature, water, right atmosphere, and all sorts of things, right kind of star, and so forth. And you can cover your bases. Even if life arises spontaneously on a planet, it doesn't mean it's ever going to evolve into something significant. You may never get past single-celled organisms, or you may stop at cockroaches or clams. And cockroaches and clams are not particularly good at building things such as spacecraft. One of the reasons is they lack opposable thumbs, and they can't grasp anything. That's the reason why cows can't make spacecraft either. All right, but there are other problems that they have I think are too obvious to enumerate at this point. So even if not every planet has life that develops into something reasonably intelligent, you'll play the odds, at least a few planets will, and if you have lots and lots and lots of planets out there with life, a good number of them will have intelligent life, and so the conclusion is intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe. Now, some people have observed that the jury is still out on whether there's intelligent life on this planet, but I'll let that go for the time being. Now, I want to give you several examples, 5 examples of how this drives science as we know it today. First of all, we have what's called SETI. Anybody know what SETI stands for? Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. All right, yeah. Now, the first SETI experiment was done way back in 1960. There was an astronomer named Frank Drake, and he reasoned this way. At that point, we've been broadcasting radio for about 40 years, television for about a dozen years, and if you were on an alien planet within, say, a dozen or within 40 light years, and you turned a very sensitive radio dish towards the sun, you couldn't see the Earth, but you turned it towards the solar system, and you had a very sensitive detector at the right frequency, you could actually pick up radio broadcasts and even television broadcasts from a few decades before. Anybody seen the movie Contact from 20 years ago? And in there, they get a rebroadcast of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. That was really cool. And as soon as I saw it, I know what that's all about. So that's what he thought. Well, if they can listen to us, we can listen to them. So he took a large telescope, radio telescope, and turned it towards some candidate stars and listened at certain key frequencies. What did he find? Nothing. All right? And over the years, Frank Drake and other people picked it up and worked on it. There's been some government funding in the past on this. Happy to report to you the government's out of that now, but there are 2 private initiatives funding search for SETI. And these things piggyback. They're privately funded. They piggyback on existing radio astronomy programs. Whenever they're looking at any object, they've got this thing running on the sidebars of this thing, actually collecting data at certain key frequencies where we should be able to ferret out an intelligent signal. About 20 years ago, the rage was to download on your computer software where you could take some of this data. When you're sending email and playing solitaire and stuff, your computer's usually not doing too much. We don't use much of our CPU. So in the background, this thing would run looking for intelligent signals, and all of that noise they're picking up. We've probably collected terabytes of data out there and searched through much of that, and how many intelligent signals have they found? None. 0. All right? I think it's cool. I think they should keep looking, because my prediction is we're not going to find any, but if you don't look, how will you know you won't find any? So the prediction I have is that there is no SETI out there, and so it's going to be a 0 and null result, and so far that's exactly what we see. Also, we keep sending these various Mars probes. They sent the first one 52 years ago this summer to Mars and discovered a very complex world. And every time they talk about sending another space probe to Mars, they talk about the boilerplate of looking for possibility of life, if not now, in the past. We've sent countless probes to Mars, and they all come back slamming the door shut on any life on the planet. They only to go back the next time. We just need to look in a different place this time. I think it's pretty robust. We get a lot of evidence showing that there never was any life on Mars. But keep looking. I think you should keep looking. That's the thing that keeps driving that. Don't get me wrong, I love Mars. I think it's a neat planet. But and by the way, we have rovers still operating after they've been on there for several years. We have orbiters. I think we're going to have a continual presence on Mars for some time to come. Used to, we'd go there, the spacecraft, and in its mission, we'd go for years without anything, but now we keep sending stuff, and they just keep going and going and going. So a lot of reconnaissance, no evidence of life. Also, the search for liquid water. The other night, I pointed out how common water is in the universe, but liquid water is exceedingly rare. That's the gold standard. They keep looking for places where water might exist, because without water, we don't think life is possible. We've not found it yet, but keep looking, boys. Maybe it'll help. Then the search for extrasolar planets. I mentioned the other night, 3,500 plus planets, probably closing on 4,000 soon. And how many Earth-like planets have we found? 0. All right, they try on a few, and if you want to know more about them, just go to our website, answersingenesis.org, and look for Earth-like planets, and you'll find probably a half dozen articles I've written. Every couple times a year, they have this new Earth-like planet, and I spend 5 minutes on the internet, find out why it's not, and write up a little article on our website why it's not. And finally, we have astrobiology. You all heard of that term, astrobiology? It's defined to be the study of life elsewhere in the universe. Now, did you know that every year there are scientific meetings, conferences on astrobiology? I'm a member of the American Astronomical Society. That's the professional society for astronomers. I sometimes go to these semi-annual meetings, and when I do, many times they'll have a section or even multiple sections of on astrobiology with many presentations in each one, and I can't help it. I have to go to them. They are a hoot. Now, there are 2 journals out there, one called the Journal of Astrobiology, the other one's called just Astrobiology. Both of them are online. You can go out there and download the articles if you want. One's a quarterly, one's a semi-monthly, or excuse me, a bi-monthly, and one's been around for more than a dozen years, one for more than 15 years. Did you know that you can get a PhD in astrobiology? There are several schools. One I know of particularly is University of Washington. I'm not singling them out to diss them here, but it's a joint project between the biology and astronomy departments. So you can actually get a college degree, a master's, and a graduate degree in astrobiology and be a certified astrobiologist. I've heard interviews with astrobiologists on the radio. What did I define astrobiology to be? The study of life elsewhere in the universe. How much life have we found elsewhere in the universe? 0. Apparently, astrobiology is the one science for which there is no data. That's remarkable. And they think we creationists are nutsy. All right? It's amazing how that works, isn't it? Well, anyway, let's go look at the other side of the coin. Let's suppose that ETs exist and we reject evolution and we believe in creation. So couldn't you say, well, couldn't he have created ETs? And the answer is yes, God could have created ETs. He could have. If you think I'm limiting God by saying that, and perhaps I am, but I do believe God could create ETs. That's not the question now. The question is, did he? Just like when people say, could have God created over billions of years? And the answer is yes, he could have. That's not the question. The question is, did he? So did he create ETs? And I wish Scripture would have told us clearly, no, I didn't create any other bodies anywhere else, but the Lord didn't see fit to do that. There are probably several reasons for that. I don't know what they are. I could guess, perhaps. But I'll make several observations. First of all, it appears that God's attention is centered on man. Now, I know God is beyond infinite, and he could center his concentration on many different beings at once. But if you read Scripture, it seems to be pretty focused in on mankind, and eternity for us will be focused on us. I don't think we're going to be sharing heaven and eternity with a bunch of aliens, all right, like the barroom scene in Star Wars. It just isn't going to be like that, all right? I don't think that's the way it works. And the question arises, do ETs, if they're really, really, really like us, capable with intelligence, capability to build spaceships and all this kind of stuff, do they have souls and spirits like we have? Well, if they're truly like us in every respect, I think the answer would have to be yes. So, the question, are they in need of salvation? Are they under the penalty of sin and death by sin? That's a theological question now. That's right up the Bible's alley, trying to address that one, right? So, if they are in need of salvation, you have to ask the question, why? Why were they subject to the penalty of sin? Well, a couple of possibilities. One could be that it's for Adam's sin. It talks about the whole creation being cursed or being under the bondage of sin because of man's disobedience. And so maybe it's for Adam's sin. That's why Jesus came to this world, to be born of Adam's race and be a sacrifice for us. But remember one thing, though. To the aliens, we're the aliens. To the aliens, Adam's an alien. So imagine that you're an evangelist on this alien world, and you're trying to evangelize, preach the gospel to people. Would your message not start out something like this? A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. I mean, really, that would be where you would start. You've already, by your response, you see the folly of that. That's not going to fly, is it? Okay, well, maybe it was for sin introduced on each one of their planets. Maybe each planet had their own Adam-like creature. Maybe it was called something else, but for the sake of argument, we'll call him an Adam on each one of these planets. And he fell into sin as well, which then requires a whole new race to be redeemed, just like Adam's race needed redemption. So this would then require, when Jesus came to the earth, was born of a virgin, lived a perfect life, laid down his life, atonement for our sins, rose from the dead, then ascended up into heaven to then go to another planet to do it all over again. And then go to another planet and do it again, and again, and again, and again. But I don't think so. Because what does the New Testament tell us in numerous places? Where is Jesus now? Where did he go when he left this world? He went to heaven to do what? Sit at the right hand of the Father. I asked this question a couple times, and people said, he went to go prepare a place for us. And I thought, okay, that works too, okay? So, quite literally, from Scripture, I believe Jesus died once for all. So you say, well, if these creatures, these ETs, are not in sin because of Adam's sin, or not in sin because of their own particular alien Adam sin, well, maybe these creatures don't need redemption at all. Maybe they never fell into sin in the first place. That's a possibility, but I have a problem because Romans 8 makes it pretty clear that the taint of man's sin has affected the entirety of creation. The whole creation, and I think it's talking about the whole creation. Furthermore, we find in the book of Isaiah, we find in 2 Peter chapter 3, and also in the book of Revelation, 3 different books in the Bible where it speaks of there being a new heaven and a new earth. When it says a new heaven and a new earth, I think it's talking about the totality of creation. It's going to be done away with, destroyed by fire, and then recreated and done over again. Why? Because I believe the entire creation is, as Romans 8 tells us, tainted by the effects of man's sin. And it too requires redemption. If that is the case, and I think there's a powerful scriptural argument to make that case, then it would seem that these alien perfect creatures that never fall into sin are living in a sin-tainted world. Again, a big biblical and theological problem, right? So I have real problems with this. So they are not in sin because of their sin, or not in sin because of Adam's sin, and they're not in sin, so we've exhausted the possibilities. So on the basis of all that, I don't believe that there are aliens out there truly like us. Let me go in a slightly different direction here. I want to come back to Frank Drake. In 1960, he did the first SETI experiment, and he argued the next year, in 1961, one of the first astrobiology papers, if you will, he put forth what he called his Drake equation. The Drake equation is an attempt to quantify what type of success he might have had in communicating with other alien civilizations. How many civilizations are out there that I can actually listen to their radio broadcast? And we can easily adapt the Drake equation to refer to spacefaring civilizations. What's the number of civilizations that could come here and visit with us? And his equation is just simply 7 things multiplied together. That's R times FP times N sub E times F sub L times F sub I times F sub C times L. And that is the number N. And N is simply the number of civilizations in our galaxy with which communication or visitation could be possible. And I'll run through these numbers very quickly. The first number, R, is the average number of stars formed per year in the galaxy. That's basically giving you a star formation rate. Number 2, F sub P, is the fraction of stars that have planets. Not every star is going to have planets, right? But many of them will, perhaps. Notice that F sub P, being a fraction, is between 0 and 1. R might be more than 1, but this is going to be between 0 and 1. N sub E is the average number of planets that could support, per star, that could support life. I don't have it quite grammatically there. And that's good, given as a number, but I suspect it's probably a fraction too, between 0 and 1. And then the next number is F sub L, the fraction of planets where life could exist, where life actually develops. They would say, well, in some planets they'll remain sterile even though the conditions are right for it. Again, it's a fraction between 0 and 1. And then F sub I, the fraction of planets that life develops, that actually intelligent life and civilization develops. Again, that's accounting for cockroaches and clams, right? Being the crown of creation, or evolution, as it were. And then the fraction of intelligent life, planets where intelligent life develops, where civilization, and hence technology, comes about. Maybe they get stuck in the Roman period and never get out of it for whatever reason. So not every intelligent civilization will actually develop into the technologically advanced things. And then finally, the length of time for which such civilizations could either release detectable signals or could build spacecraft and travel about. And, you know, back in the 60s, they were worried about nuclear annihilation. Now we're worried about destroying the planet with climate change and such. We have such hubris thinking that we're going to destroy ourselves. We'll humor them, put on, a century or 1,000 years, whatever you think the estimate is, we'll eventually pass off the scene. So, you got 7 terms, you multiply those 7 terms together, and you get your answer of how many civilizations are out there. Everybody clear on that? Now, how many of those terms do we know? Well, Drake didn't know any of them. So you got a nifty equation with seven quantities to give you your 8th one, but you don't know any of the 7 quantities. So what do? Well, if you're a scientist like I am, you've got a PhD behind your name, you estimate those numbers. Now see, if you don't have a PhD behind your name, you can't do that. You'd just be guessing. All right? But I don't guess, I estimate. All right? Same thing, but okay, whatever. Now, the estimates vary widely. As a creationist, I tend to be very pessimistic about some of these estimates. For instance, I think the probability of life arising is 0. That's based on my understanding of creation, and it's based upon my understanding of science. Good science says that life doesn't come from non-life. That's the law of biogenesis, isn't it? So good science indicates that's the case. But many other scientists have very optimistic estimates. And by the way, I've been distressed by Christians that buy into this sort of argument we have going on here. I went to a Christian high school my last year of high school, and one of the teachers there, she wasn't one of my teachers, but she knew me because it was a smaller school, and she found out at some point that I wanted to go into astronomy, and she thought that was so exciting. She asked me about life on other planets, and I started to tell her I don't think so, and her response was, well, but what about all those stars and all those planets that might be out there? Couldn't there be? And her argument she was making sounded just like Frank Drake. She thought she was, why wouldn't God make life on these other planets? But she was actually arguing the same on the terms that evolutionists would argue. And I don't think we ought to be doing that. And many of you, I think, really get that. Anyway, well, until recently, none of them were measured at all. We could even argue that yet they've not been actually measured. But we do have information now on at least 2 of the numbers to help box it in. For instance, F sub P, the fraction of stars that have planets, and N sub B, the number of planets per star that could support life, we actually have some data to give us some indications about that. For one thing, we've discovered 3,500 plus planets. There are a lot of planets out there. So I know one thing. I know F sub P is not 0. It may not be 1, but it's certainly not 0. So you've got some numbers now. But until 25 years ago, we didn't know if any planets existed outside the solar system. Now, keep in mind one thing. If any one of those 7 numbers is equal to 0, does it matter what the other 6 are? No. And again, I'm very pessimistic about the possibility of life arising naturalistic. I think that probability is 0, so consequently the other 6 are irrelevant at that point. Well, can we even show better than that? Again, 3,500 known extrasolar planets. This helps us evaluate F sub P, as I just said. But I'm of the opinion that none of those 3,500 planets we found are actually conducive for life. They keep trying, but no cigars, I would say, in all the cases, because there are problems either with the planets themselves or with the stars or both. But if we go ahead and throw the Earth in there and take the 3,500 and divide it into 1, we end up with 0.0003, and that's a pretty small number, but it's not 0, is it? And so consequently, if the other numbers are pretty small, but the R, the star formation rate's pretty high, then you could have millions and millions of civilizations out there, couldn't you? Except there's one thing, we probably ought to throw the Earth out. We know the Earth supports life. That's not the question. The question is there another planet like that? So if we throw the Earth out, we've now got 3,500 planets, none with any life on it. And so we conclude, and this is what the science is telling you, what the data are telling you now, we find out that n is equal to 0. N is equal to 0. So consequently, to answer the question, are we alone in the universe? I can stand up here today, confidently tell you, scientifically, yes, we are alone in the universe. How do I know that? It's based upon a sample size of 3,500 extrasolar planets, none of which are Earth-like. Now somebody might say, well, wait a minute, the sample size isn't complete yet. And indeed it's not, because it keeps discovering more and more extrasolar planets. But let me ask you this, when is a sample size ever complete in any experiment? Can you always go collect more data? So what you're telling me is you can never reach a conclusion because you can always collect more data, can't you? Well, that's silly. Scientists every day reach conclusions on incomplete data, and what happens is more data comes along that contradicts their conclusion. They throw the conclusion out and make a new conclusion. But for some reason, we get down to this one question, the sudden paralysis hits every scientist on the planet, it seems like, and they refuse to make a decision on this, reach a conclusion. Why? Well, because it disagrees with their preconceived notion, doesn't it? That's extreme bias, folks. Extreme bias. If you look at it objectively, you will have to conclude, based upon the data that we have in hand, there are no Earth-like planets, there are no other beings like us, we are alone in the universe. That's a good, sound, solid scientific conclusion. But apparently I'm the only person on the planet making that conclusion. Now, someone might say, well, wait a minute, maybe next week or next month or next year we might discover an Earth-like planet. My response is, well, fine, call me next week, next month, next year when you do. And then we'll talk about it. But right now, we can't base our science upon what we might know tomorrow. We've got to base our science on what we know right now. And science changes all the time, and scientists ought to know that science changes. So scientifically, I think we can safely say at this point we are alone. Biblically, I've already made the argument before, I think we are alone in the universe. Don't you love it when the science agrees with the Bible? Notice I didn't ask when the Bible agrees with science. That's putting it backwards, because science isn't the standard, the Bible is. So I love it when the science agrees with the Bible. Well, does this preclude animal life, plant life, microorganisms? You see, my argument has been based upon the assumption of that working with intelligent life. And, let's face it, plants and microorganisms aren't terribly bright, are they? All right? So maybe you could get around that. Well, I would have to agree with you that that's a weak argument at this point against a planet like that. But let me offer a couple of observations here. First of all, there's the question of dominion. That's given in Genesis 1 and 2. It's also given in Psalm 8 very clearly. We're in charge. We're to be stewards. The resources on this planet are for our benefit, not to abuse them, but to use them. I get tickled about people talking about recycling and all this stuff. Back when I was growing up in the 60s, the big thing was use once and throw away. Remember that? People my age? Yeah, use, throw. That was advertised on TV. Use once and throw away. Everything was just being thrown away. And I was always very conservative. I would go out in the country and with a wagon and collect pop bottles and take them in and cash them in and get all the candy and ice cream. I could eat myself under the table with it. My mom used to buy these little lunch sacks in the early 60s, send my lunch to school, and I'd get done, I'd throw away the napkin. It was dirty, and the aluminum foil, and it was dirty. But then the bag was just fine. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I'd fold it up, put it in my pocket, and take it home. So I've been into recycling all my entire life. I'm way ahead of everybody on that one. Nobody can preach to me on recycling, okay? And furthermore, it means we're supposed to treat the other resources, trees and plants and animals and such. And so consequently, I am a firm believer and supporter of PETA. People eating tasty animals. I was so excited yesterday at breakfast because I've already told people, what did we have? Bacon. bacon. There will be pork in heaven, folks. Trust me. There will be. All right, there has to be. Otherwise, the stuff we'll eat will taste like bacon, all right, and sausage and tenderloin, all that sort of stuff, right? At any rate, we have a dominion. And what a point I'm making here is that everything in creation around us has a purpose for our food, for our resources. But again, we're supposed to be good stewards and to treat it well. We're not really honoring the Lord if we don't. So it's not just rape and pillage the environment. We do need to be good stewards of what we find out there. So if you had a planet just like the Earth, except people weren't there, I have a real problem with that, theologically, design-wise. What's the point? There's nobody to be in charge like we have on the Earth. And most animals seem to get that. They know we're in charge instinctively. Also, just the food for thought, are plants alive biblically? In the book of Leviticus, there is a requirement for life. It says the life is in the blood. Plants don't have blood. Microorganisms don't have blood. Lots of things don't have blood. Now, I'm not going to say that plants and microorganisms are not alive in some sense, but in the biblical sense, they are not alive. And it's hard to find passages in the Bible that talks about a plant ever dying. They wither and they fade, but they don't die because they were never alive to start with, at least in God's sight. All right. I'll conclude with this. Some people writing on this and speaking about this talk about a spiritual battle that we're involved in. And I do believe there's a component here, but there's a thing I want to caution you about. There are a lot of books out there written on this from this perspective, and I have a problem with what they're saying. They note that Satan sometimes appears as an angel of light, according to 2 Corinthians 11:14. And they seem to then say, well, most UFO sightings are lights in the sky, so therefore those lights in the skies could be manifestations of demonic activity. And they usually tie that in to some sort of eschatological teachings that it's going to fit very well with their ideas about end times. And they may talk about occult connections and all these sorts of things. And I have real misgivings about that approach. And I suspect most of you, given your systematic theology, probably would have the same misgivings about these things as well. But I have a real problem with this. I just don't think it's a good argument to make for these things. We can explain far more of this stuff on the terms of misidentifications and hoaxes and such. And I think when people get all excited about this, they lose sight. I've read some of the books out there, and they just accept every UFO sighting as being a legitimate flying saucer or whatever sort of thing, demonic activity, and they don't spend any time debunking them. And that's not good. It's not really being very circumspect about the whole question. Now, having said that, this fantastic thing of demonic activity everywhere, fooling people and setting up for end times, do I believe there's no contact with demonic deception at all? I don't think so. I think there is, but it's extremely subtle. You'll find that virtually everyone, or nearly everyone, who believes that we've been visited here on Earth by flying saucers also are committed to belief in evolution. And it then reinforces a belief in evolution. And you see, if we evolved, then there is no God. If there is no God, there is no sin. If there is no sin, there is no need for redemption. If there's no need for redemption, I haven't a clue what Jesus Christ was doing 2,000 years ago, but it wasn't saving our souls, was it? And so this whole thing stirring up this belief in UFOs, whether there really are demonic deceptions or not, is immaterial. Just the belief that these things are real deflects our attention from the true and living God. So if there's a satanic or demonic connection here, this is it, and boy, is it subtle. Real quick point here at the end. A lot of science fiction stories, movies, TV, books, they talk about aliens and so forth, and you might come out of here thinking, well, he doesn't like aliens, doesn't like science fiction. Well, no, I like good science fiction. There's a lot of bad science fiction out there, but I like good science fiction. You've got to remember one thing about science fiction, though. What is that? It's fiction. It's make-believe. And fiction can be a very good vehicle. Pilgrim's Progress is fiction, but it's a good vehicle to get across a lesson. I've been working for some time on a particular, off and on, a sci-fi story that has something to say about creation evolution. Another one is going to have something, it's going to be a story about time travel. It's going to have things about the resurrection and the biblical history and so forth. It's really going to be a cool story. If I ever get around to writing, I've got it in my head, I just haven't committed. Don't have the time or the I guess maybe the commitment to do it yet. But I think good science fiction. If you have a problem with science fiction, maybe you ought to leave it alone for a while. But if you can keep it in check, it's really a fine vehicle. And I think it'd be great if we had more Christian writers writing good science fiction with a message behind it. Well, I've talked about UFOs today. I wanted to tell you about a little booklet that I have. It's called these pocket guides. We have 19 of them in our series here at AIG. I only brought 6 titles, one on astronomy and this one, 4 others. The one on astronomy, I wrote one of the chapters, but this one I wrote entirely myself. And what I talked about today and much, much more is included in this pocket guide. And they normally sell for $5.99, but when we go on the road like this for special conferences, we offer them for $2 a piece. And even though I've sold out of 2 of my other 3 books, and I only have 3 of the other third book is still in stock out there, I do have a nice supply of these. I will add, however, that I'm going to have to leave tomorrow about midday. So if you're going to buy anything at the book table from Answers in Genesis, you need to do it today, this afternoon, tonight, or in the morning, because right after lunch I intend to pack up and take off.